In this video, we're going to be discussing expansion devices, which on an automotive AC system is an expansion valve or an orifice tube. Your expansion device in the system is very important. It's actually creating a restriction in the system. That way you are dropping the pressure of the refrigerant, allowing it to fill up the evaporator, which is what makes the evaporator cold, which is what lets the evaporator absorb the heat from the system. That way you get cold air out of the vents. Now let's take a look at expansion valves. We'll talk about two different types. We'll talk about block valves, and we'll actually talk about internal and externally regulated 90-degree brass valves. Expansion valve is always going to be bolted directly to the evaporator, and you'll have your liquid line and your suction hose both bolted to it. Like the orifice tube, which is fixed, this one actually is variable. Temperature will vary the flow rate in and out of the evaporator. On an internal regulated expansion valve, what you have is a spring inside of here that is putting some counter pressure on this diaphragm on the inside, and there's actually a little bit of refrigerant inside of this tube. So what happens when that refrigerant heats up, it's going to put pressure on the tube here, and it's going to change the position of this diaphragm to change the flow rate. Now this one is actually a externally regulated expansion valve. It actually uses pressure from the other line to regulate the pressure here, so we're actually working against each other a little bit here to change the flow rate. Let's take a look at the orifice tube. The orifice tube is always going to be in the liquid line of the system. Sometimes it can be at the condenser, it can be in the middle of the liquid line, it can be at the evaporator, but it's always in the liquid line. And there's actually an arrow here that you want to make sure the refrigerant flows correctly. Just be mindful of the O-ring here. That's actually the only thing that's holding back all the pressure in the AC system between the high and the low side. Common reason for failure on an orifice tube. Most of the time, since the orifice tube doesn't have any moving parts, it usually won't fail by itself. There is a filter on it, a very fine screen, and any debris in the system, anything that comes out of the compressor when you have a compressor failure will be stuck in the screen of that orifice tube, and so it just needs to be replaced. Expansion valves do have moving parts. If you have an expansion valve that is stuck closed, you'll have high pressure in the system. You won't have the correct amount of refrigerant running through your evaporator, and you can actually damage a new compressor that way. If you have an expansion valve that's stuck open, you won't have enough pressure in the system to cause the pressure drop that you need to get that refrigerant to the temp you need to get cold air out of your vents. If you have a vehicle with rear air, say an Explorer, Tahoe, something like that with rear air on it, a lot of times what you'll find, you're actually going to have an orifice tube for the front evaporator and an expansion valve for the rear. So just pay attention to the description when you're looking up a vehicle. If it has rear air, you probably have an expansion valve in the rear. You could have an orifice tube or an expansion valve up front, but either way they're not going to be interchangeable, so you just need to make sure you're selling the correct one.